Hello and welcome to Property Question Time. I'm Stephen Galpin and this is the show where you can have your property related questions answered by a team of property experts. And joining me today is Richard Murray, CEO of Eurolink, providers of Echo property management software. Welcome.
Thanks, Stephen.
John Reynolds is joining you, founder of Titan Property Developments. Welcome to you, John.
Thank you.
Hope you've both had a good journey in today and not suffered any strike mishaps.
Very straightforward.
Good. Okay.
Thankfully.
Great stuff. Okay, John, we're going to go with you first. I'm a small property developer and I'm suffering badly from down valuations on my properties, which is beginning to drain confidence from my funding bankers. I have asked if they would use different valuers, but say the ones that they're using have a contract for the bank's lending portfolio. The issue I have is that they keep quoting pessimistic future market as the reason for the down valuations. But I understand RICS Red Book guidelines say you should value as of today. What can I do?
That's a tough one. Surveyors, the guidelines should be based on exact comparables right now. But we know with surveyors, guidelines aren't always what are adhered to. So they are looking into a bit of a bleak future. They're taking into account that as of October, I think it was 28 months in a row, property prices had increased. And that was the first time we saw a drop. And it's clearly heading that way with interest rates that have gone up and continue to do so. So I think from a surveyor point of view, they're being incredibly cautious. And I think as the developer asking the question, and any developer looking to bring it into the market, you've got to be very careful not to be trying to break any pound per square foot values or trying to do anything that's going to be the top end of the market, because a surveyor is going to be looking to be pessimistic. It's a really tricky time to navigate that.
Well, okay, can we just look at the motivation there of a valuer? I mean, valuers need to be doing valuations to make money.
Yeah.
Okay. Banks, of course, need to be cautious and make sure that their lending is sensible and not out of kilter with the market. But it almost seems that they're depressing the market themselves.
Yeah, they have too much control. This is something I've been on the receiving end as a developer. And they have so much control. I've even got one of the lenders involved in one of my projects. It wasn't a value issue, it was, they cited it was too close to light industrial. And we actually got the head of the region of a lender who came and walked around every single property and said, this is great, we love this, we like to lend. They're incentivized to get their money out, but they couldn't overturn the opinion, and I use that word opinion, of the surveyor. So the motivation is an interesting one, because the surveyor is instructed by the purchaser to gain a mortgage. They actually are paid to do that, but the surveyor is reporting to the lender and they're trying to protect the lender. But actually sometimes there's a complete difference of opinion where the lender's saying, we would like to lend. So it's one of those really frustrating situations where you've got a clash.
I think one of the other problems is that everything is so software orientated now, so we'll blame Richard for that, that, you know, if your valuer does put a low valuation on, the trouble is it's recorded, it goes into the data bank, doesn't it? And everybody else sees it, and takes a brave man to go against it, I guess.
Yes, I've got, again, unfortunately, personal experience of that. It's an essential database. I mean, that's something I was going to suggest as per the question. An answer can be that, you know, you can try a different surveyor. You know, you could commission it yourself. You can work out different ways of trying to mitigate that. But the other surveyor will look on the database and see exactly what the report was from the one that was instructed for the bank. So one thing you can do as the developer is look to try and compile evidence of comparables that have been achieved that might not be showing yet on the database. They might be recent, or just the fact that the surveyor hasn't taken them into account. It's highly unlikely it'll change their opinion, but just in answer to that question of what can I do, you can try and find some extra information.
Evidence,
because they need to listen to that.
That's the difficulty, isn't it? Although, you know, you could argue, for instance, that a contract has exchanged, therefore it's contractually binding. Valuers still won't take that into account until completion takes place, and completion only gets registered with Land Registry probably 3 months after the event.
But the lenders have that data.
Yes, they do.
Interestingly, so actually, can the lenders help in the provision of very recent data? Because then actually Land Registry is irrelevant.
Yeah. And that's also the most relevant information, the flow of sales, particularly for that type of product, exact comparables. So again, putting it back to the developer, if they're trying to push above where they should, then that's something to be very careful of. But if there are comparables to your product in recent sales, then really they're the guidelines. That's what you're working with, not what's happening in 6 months, 12 months time.
Yeah.
What about your reservations as well? Is that something if people have just doesn't stand up, I guess? Or
No, they want actual sales.
Yeah, fair enough.
They're very suspicious.
People have made a commitment now, haven't they? They've made some sort of commitment, and there's got to be value in that data rather than necessarily it's not. Maybe it's weighted.
Yes.
Maybe there's a weighting to the data that the reservation data can have some sort of lower weighting to the recent transactions with the lender. I'm sure in a data world, it's there.
Well, we had a lot of problems here in Canary Wharf where valuers were saying, well, look, over the next 2 or 3 years, there's 20-odd thousand apartments coming online. We can just see a huge softening of the market when all these come to market. But again, they're supposed to be looking at what the situation is today, because I think we all know, especially in this climate, a lot of those 20,000 won't get completed, certainly on the time scale that's been suggested. So it's quite a difficult thing to assess. But I think you're right. I think the data is there. I think these guys just need to wake up a bit and get themselves into a data world, really.
Yeah,
it'll catch up, I agree.
I agree with that. And something about the amount of control that they have would be very welcome, because they are frustrating both the lenders and the purchasers. We've had purchasers that have been refunded their deposits because we've not been able to get them the mortgage, or they've not been able to get the mortgage on properties we are developing, and they're just so frustrated.
Yeah. I think the one thing, just to finish the subject of, I do feel sorry where people are looking to downsize and buy something else, or upsize and move because of family situations or school situations, that kind of thing. I don't think these valuers really just quite understand how catastrophic these low valuations can be and how taxing they can be on perhaps a family trying to move or trying to upgrade or downgrade even. It really does have a very real effect on family life, doesn't it? Yeah. Very real.
Yeah, 100%.
Anyway, there we are. Richard, what do the panel think about the current and future prospects of trading property in the meta world? Some of the cryptocurrency traders are hitting the predicted difficulties. Will meta world go the same way?
Wow. We're talking about an unregulated world that so any investment is going to be highly speculative. It's not my area of expertise. However, in terms of the digital revolution, I mean, we're still at the start really of a digital revolution. Web3, all about a more immersive experience online and on the internet. But the cryptos, particularly with FTX going bust recently, I mean that's obviously sent shockwaves around the world, and the vast majority, well, I think all properties bought in the metaverse are bought with some sort of crypto, Ethereum or Bitcoin or some sort of cryptocurrency is part of the transaction. So I think with that that's really wobbled things.
Well, look, I'm awfully sorry, but I mean, perhaps being a bit of a dinosaur, but quite frankly, if somebody tried to sell me a sort of cardboard version of Canary Wharf here, and did I want to invest and probably rent it out, I think I'd have to look at them with some kind of skepticism, shall we say? It's a polite word. I mean, I was looking online the other day, and somebody said the only person that believes the meta world is real is Zuckerberg. But are we all being taken for a ride here?
I think you've got to take a real world example then. So Nike, for example, huge brand, yeah. Nike took one of the early adopters, if you like, and took virtual space in the metaverse. They've had 26 million visitors in the first 12 months. So I would say there's something there that tells me that, let's say, a retailer who wants people to come to a virtual space to show their stock or to be more interactive, more immersive, as the phrase goes, maybe if you'd have bought that, You're looking at me very, very sceptical. How do we convert Stephen into a metaverse investor? And I'm not. Again, it's not my area. But what I would suggest is there? You just mentioned it actually. Is there a buy-to-let opportunity here? If you have, let's say, companies, not talking about Nike here, but smaller companies who are very wary, like you are, very wary, very sceptical. Well, if they could do it at arm's length on a lettings basis, maybe there's a world there where the experts can say, look, we're going to safely transact through crypto. We're going to buy this space and we're going to rent this space. That actually takes all your skepticism almost out of the picture.
Well, Richard, it does. But you see, I see people wearing these, I don't know what they're called. These
VR headsets.
Right, headsets. Yeah. And do you know what? I could get an amazing in-depth vision of what's outside here, couldn't I?
Yeah.
On the other hand, I could walk through the door downstairs and just go and see it for real.
You could if you're on the doorstep, but I don't know, John, if you do virtual viewings, I'm sure you do.
We do.
And again, headsets on, I'm not in the area. I can view one of your properties, I'm assuming.
Yeah. No, you can.
Yeah.
But the level into the metaverse and it is another level of conversation.
Sure,
I've not. I want to entertain it because even the Nike example is interesting. I didn't know that.
Yeah.
And I've explored NFTs myself as a personal investment. I didn't go into crypto. Many people around me have, and of course, it's right now as we sit here, it's a disaster. But what will it be next year?
Well, what do you think NFTs are going to end up if crypto crashes?
Yeah,
I think that's the thing.
There's a little bit of stick to what you know.
Listen, I'm going to tell you something. I did an interview with a guy called Bob Wrigley, who is quite a senior guy in the city, and he wrote a book on Generation Z.
Sure.
And he says the danger starts when the kids upstairs are actually texting mum to see what time dinner's ready. And I think that's the start of a very dangerous path. Okay.
We're in that world.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, there we are. That's all we've got time for this half of the show. Join me again after the break when we'll be asking Richard and John more of your questions. Hello, welcome back to part 2 of Property Question Time. I'm joined by Richard Murray and John Reynolds. Thank you for joining us again. And John, we'll get on with your second question. I understand the government is intending to outlaw the banking of development sites by limiting the time to start development post getting planning consent. Do the panel think this really will encourage developers to develop more quickly, even if the economic conditions don't indicate a favourable marketing climate?
Yeah, use it or lose it. It's been talked about for a while, hasn't it?
Yeah.
This only really affects the big boys, the Persimmons, the Taylor Wimpey's. And I do think that as running it as a business, you've got to have a pipeline. You've got to be able to forward plan. So land banking in that context and strategizing is clearly something that you've got to do. I can't afford to do that. I buy something and I'm instantly looking to get the planning and then, So it only really affects the bigger guys. I get the frustration. I think there's 1.1 million homes that have achieved planning over the last X amount of years and haven't been developed. So if you look at that as a stat, but there's possibly lots of reasons why. I mean, gosh, how volatile have the last few years been, from Brexit to COVID and all sorts of scenarios that actually may mean you don't want to be bringing too much stock to the market, in context of saleability and so on. So it's a wider issue than just potentially saying use it or lose it, or I think they're talking about a levy on council tax once you've achieved planning. That's instantly going to be penalising the developer, but not really achieving the end result, which is that may still not force them to actually develop the land. There may be other factors involved that stop that. Do you go with all this government intervention into policy? Because people have heard me say it on this show many times. I just believe that if you allow a market to have its own ups and downs, in the up times, if a developer thinks he can sell and his purchasers can fund a purchase, he'll build as much as you want. There'll be no shortage of stock. It should self-police. Yeah, I agree with that. I think, and I think developers have done that. And I think there's some developers that have probably been looked at as not having developed enough, and they're probably feeling quite exposed right now. And a lot of the product that these guys bring to the market is quite linear. It's quite vanilla. It's all very similar. And so there are certain instances where there's potentially saturation, even though we talk about there's not enough supply. some of these developers have brought a lot of supply to one particular area of one type of product. It's the diversity that's potentially needed. And that doesn't, again, get solved by this use it or lose it. It's, it's a bigger problem than that.
Are we also talking about, I mean, couldn't if it's the big boys who are the problem and there's a use it or lose it campaign, I mean, you're talking about planning permission, Stephen, but I mean, they could tie things up in reserve matters for years.
Yeah.
Easy.
Yeah.
So I think even if something was implemented, in my small sort of amount of experience, you can sit for years on reserve matters and make as complex an argument either way as you wish. Yeah. So I think it's the planning laws that need the reform. Maybe not the developers that need to be forced into doing things.
I think you're dead right. But I think the difficulty is twofold, isn't it? If you have a government that then says, right, everything's relaxed, then what happens is the banks get criticised for lending too much. Yeah. Their balance sheets, in theory, get more I won't say weaker, but more vulnerable. Let's put it that way. So you get rid of the government restrictions, and then you end up with the banking restrictions. It's very difficult. And I can remember many years ago going over to Japan and meeting the president of quite a big company that had gone worldwide in actually a very short period of time in terms of company history. And he said to me that the reason that they'd been so successful is that the government had given them 25-year money. So they could plan, they knew what they could do to hedge against, inflation, against fluctuations in exchange rates. They could just plan because they knew the money was there. And I think our construction industry, our development industry has got to have that same confidence, got to know that the money's there, that the market's going to be there, and that people are going to be able to fund their purchases. Yeah. And if we don't have that, we're stuffed, aren't we, really?
Yeah, and I think marrying the planning side of things, if you could actually make sure there's a real collaboration. It does feel like there's a battle between developers, planners, the banks, the whole thing it's not aligned. And then we have this big moan and frustration, and developers are seen as the enemy because they're not providing and doing what they should, but they're making too much money. But actually the developers would do a lot more if it was, as you say, much clearer with a timeline of what they can achieve without policies changing and, housing ministers changing every, it seems like every kind of few months.
Well, the average tenure of a housing minister at the moment is about 11 months.
So it's about 11 months, yeah.
Yeah, that's frightening. That's really difficult to plan, and so from that point of view, I think if there's just a real collaboration and time spent on that to then achieve an end goal that works.
That needs to happen locally. You're talking about an example with a central drive. Let's say, you're talking about central government making decisions. You must have any given number of, I'm sure we shouldn't name any particular local authorities, but I've said, again, in my small amount of experience, you've got local authorities who are like, how can we help? How can we make this scheme work? And ones that you just think, this is just political.
Yeah, and they won't even entertain a conversation.
Not interested.
Yeah.
Now, that's the collaboration piece I think you're talking about.
I am.
But I think the combination of that centralised push and strategy that everyone has to toe the line from.
Sure.
But how you get that into
that's why I was smiling, getting everyone around the room, and because it goes back to its same personal opinion. It goes back to
politics. Yeah,
exactly. Which is frustrating.
Well, it does, and the system as well. I mean, if you take sort of out of London, you get your parish council who then report to the main authority. I mean, what is the use of that parish council? I mean, fine, I know you want to understand and accept and listen to local residents' opinions, but there's too much power there. There's too much, that process can take 3 or 4 months.
Oh, the NIMBYs must be a huge problem to you guys. Yeah.
It's the lack of consistency.
I mean, I can remember with one particular parish council I dealt with, and she said, she threw my plans around the table, and she said, "You better see what this man thinks he wants to build in our village." And yet, when I went up to the higher council, to the authority that was going to give, they said, "This is amazing. This is just what we want. This is, how do you plan for that?"
I've got countless examples, as you can imagine. I've sat in committee meetings where it's over a certain size of development, it goes to committee, and you're not allowed to say anything. You've got a planning consultant representing, and some of the comments, some of the things that are said are so you know, they're archaic. You know, and you're just there going, you're chewing a hole in your cheek, just wishing you could say something. Going, what? You know, we followed guidelines to get to that point.
Yeah. Yeah. I once sat in one of those, and one local councillor said, "Well, I don't like the look of it." Okay, well, let's not build those 122 homes then.
It obviously been on a course.
I've
Right.
got a lot of examples like that.
Okay, Richard, your question. There are many firms now advertising management and sales support software for estate agents. Nearly all offer comprehensive data support to facilitate this. Where does the line sit in keeping the agent free from contravening any data protection laws, controlling the amount and type of and use of data made available? Is that a complex question? I don't know.
It's actually pretty straightforward in that 2018 everything changed, GDPR was implemented, and products like ours had to obviously prepare for that. We were given time, just as with any legislation allows for time. Obviously case law follows, but the principles are set. And GDPR, I mean, there's sort of 4 key principles. There's the right to be forgotten, right to access, data portability, but ultimately it's all in the design. It's all privacy by design. So what I mean by that is software companies like us had to make sure that the design of our software allowed for the support of this important legislation. And it was important because it had become a little bit Wild West, and people wanted more security around their own personal data. It's not a lot to ask, I don't think. But the difficulty for us was, look, how do we design this? And we took our time, we took months to make sure we designed the right functionality and features. So for instance, when you're trying to put a contact on a Vico system, you're immediately asked by a pop-up, have you got consent to take this data? So the software drives good habits, and those good habits will then allow a company to make sure its users follow the legislation. But yeah, I mean, right to be forgotten, it's pretty obvious, it is what it is. There has to be functionality within the software that can anonymize the data. It doesn't delete the data, of course, because products like ours have got a client accounting function. You know, you might have a right to save that data for up to 6 years, for example. So again, by design, has to make sure that you can, after a certain point in an accounting system, you can anonymize that data to make sure that it complies with the legislation. I
was just thinking though, when you said you have a right to hold on to data, I mean, I'm just thinking, for instance, I can't remember what the numbers are now, but say inland revenue, for instance, say you've got to keep records for, say, 6 years or whatever it is. So it might fall into that category where the data you've collected might be necessary to comply with the Inland Revenue Directive. So
absolutely.
There are a lot of factors coming in, aren't
exactly. And the other side of that is you have a right to hold that data for that period of time.
Well, an obligation.
Obligation, yeah, a better word, yeah. You've then got, you've got to build in the functionality for people to say, well, I want access. I want you to tell me what you've got of my data. So that has to be produced in what's called a machine readable format. Excel spreadsheet to the rest of the world. But a machine readable format, you've got to be able to produce that report to say to that person, that's what we're holding. So that's just a right to access. And then the same process, the Excel spreadsheet output effectively for the sort of data portability to be able to move the data as well. So yeah, the legislation's very clear. There's lots of case law since 2018. And again, anyone looking at software, just make sure that you ask that question. How does your software deal with GDPR? And you should get a very straightforward answer, perhaps a demonstration or some documentation that will allow you to make sure that you're doing the right thing by the legislation for your company.
Okay, on that note, thank you very much indeed, both of you. Great show, great answers to the questions. Some of them are a bit technical, but there we are. That's very good. Thank you both very much indeed. So Richard Mace, CEO of Eurolink, thank you for coming in. John Reynolds, founder of Titan Property Developments, thank you for coming in. I'm Stephen Galpin. Join me again next time on Property Question Time.